The Slave and the Sorcerer. This is a 2024 fantasy sword and sorcery movie from director Laurie Brewster, who also co-wrote this movie and has a small role in it. Brewster probably most notable for the movie Aaran, also known as Lord of Tears, but he has dabbled in fantasy movies before. So this one is a throwback movie filmed in the style of the kind of the 80s sword and sorcery kind of craze that spawned the likes of Deathstalker, Sword and the Sorcerer, and Ator, and it kind of this movie is influenced by them. I actually think if you want to have a good old 80s throwback night, you could put on a treble bill with this, Commando Ninja and Turbo Kid. You've kind of got fantasy, action and sci-fi all covered off in some throwback goodness. So this is meant to be a somewhat kind of cheesy film. I'm a big fan of the sword and sorcery movies from the 80s, so I kind of appreciated this throwback kind of style movie. There's lots of kind of references both to the kind of the fantasy style Italian kind of movies that you would have got like Ator, but also just 80s movies in general. There's quite a loving homage to Commando, Schwarzenegger's Commando, which I quite appreciated. You know, there's lots of kind of reverence for that sort of time period and pop culture around that kind of area. So the story takes place in a kind of fantastical landscape, and we have this princess that is kidnapped by a sorcerer who is the brother to the reigning king. And effectively this princess is to be married to this kind of knight who wants to, they want to join kingdoms, but she has eyes for our kind of slave barbarian character. But the king decides he's going to send out a group of individuals to try and rescue his daughter from this evil sorcerer and this kind of knight, this barbarian slave, along with a few other notable members of this kind of party, this fellowship, if you will, and they are off to try and rescue the princess through various kind of dungeons, facing monsters, traps, and the like. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So this is really made for the fantasy fans of the 80s. Laurie Brewster has talked a lot about Deathstalker. Incidentally, there is actually a new Deathstalker. Deathstalker 5 will be coming out at some point. So it's curious to see how that will stack up against this. But it definitely does, I would say, emulates a lot of that 80s kind of style. A lot of the kind of the cheesiness, the bad wigs, the kind of the over-the-top acting, things like this, that if you've enjoyed certainly some of the lower budget end of the fantasy movies from the 80s, you'd appreciate the kind of the reverence here. So let's talk about what does work. I mean, it's very much of that time in regards to its presentation. So I think if you enjoy it if you like those type of movies. If you don't, this one isn't going to kind of change your mind. There's kind of a good array of different characters. Our little party, you know, we've got a thief, we've got a barbarian, we've got a knight, we've got a witch. So it makes for some kind of interesting kind of character dynamics. The movie never takes itself super seriously without kind of going into pure spoof territory. So that it has this kind of irreverent sort of humour that's kind of running through it. But you can kind of still watch it and enjoy it for a swashbuckling adventure. And I think back in the days, these 80s movies, these original movies, I think for the most part, I don't think were necessarily trying to be humorous. Some were, like Deathstalker 2 was definitely more of a comedic one. But there are certainly the Ator films were never designed to be comedies exactly. It's just how they turned out and looking back at them now. But I think this movie kind of strikes a good balance between having an actual kind of plot with characters and stakes and stuff, along with having, you know, just silly fun with the concept. You know, it is a low budget movie, but we do end up with dragons, we end up with giant spiders, we've got kind of spectral sort of creatures, we've got stone knights. So we've kind of got a lot of aspects in this movie, I think, to make it a variety of different kind of challenges, along with kind of some traps and stuff. And you know, sometimes when you get the characters, they don't, oh, I kind of like that character, I wish he kind of made it to the end, that sort of thing. So I think it's, even though the character work isn't exactly what you'd call deep, I think it's, you get enough of an individual idea of these characters, so they kind of register when certain characters might, you know, bite the dust and things like that. And there's some kind of quite fun fight scenes, and I will say things like the kind of the set decoration, the kind of the costuming, things like that. Again, for a low budget movie, I think they do a pretty good, you know, standard here of having these kind of medieval kind of style aesthetics, you know, while mixing this kind of fantasy sword and sorcery kind of look, to give you kind of an interesting movie visually, certainly. And it kind of looks cheap, but that's kind of the point. And I think if you appreciate those 80s movies, and just 80s movies in general, you'll probably kind of quite like it. I think the heroes are likeable. You know, you can boo hit at the villain. So I think overall, it's kind of a fun romp for those of you who are understanding what this movie is trying to emulate. Like I've said, I think if you kind of want to have a treble bill with this, Turbo Kid, and Commando Ninja, I think you'll be in for a good night. I don't think it's quite as strong as its other two, to be honest, but nonetheless, it's still a you know, a fun adventure that I think most people would enjoy. What doesn't work, I do feel this movie is a little bit limited in some of its scope. I mean, I always think of fantasy movies, you've got, you know, people riding around on horses, and I would have liked to have seen a little bit more external shots. This movie is primarily filmed on sets in kind of like dungeons and things, and we never really get to see like the world. And I always think of like the 80s fantasy movies, quite like open spaces and things like that, and we see very little of that. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more, you know, guys on horses and things like that, and a little bit more of the world. Again, it's probably a budgetary issue more than anything else, so it kind of feels small scale. We don't really get any sense of where these people are in regards to one another, because it just cuts to these people kind of going through this dungeon, which seems more or less next door to where our kind of you know, our sorcerer is being. So the distance from where they're travelling to and from, you never really feel like it's, you know, you get a good sense of that, because it's really just kind of internal sequences in rooms and things, and you never really get a feel of where these characters are on like a quest or anything like that. So there's that. Having this movie, I assumed when I was watching this was going to be about a central character, this kind of barbarian. And it is, but I feel this movie ends up being more of a team movie. And as I said, I think the character work is just about okay, where you can, you know, you feel the loss where someone dies, but you never really feel you get a good sense of kind of who the characters really are. Even if you look at the 80s movies, and you know, we've mentioned movies like Ator and Deathstalker and Sword and Sorcerer and stuff, I still feel you got a better sense of the actual characters than you maybe did in this one. So I feel this movie, although it's fun and it does emulate, I think, some of the styles here, it doesn't quite, you never quite gravitate to the characters quite as much. I have to say as well, I think sometimes it goes a little bit overboard with the hamminess and the cheesiness and the overacting. Because as I've mentioned, I think when we look back at these 80s movies, they weren't really made to be this kind of campy and cheesy and over the top. It was just how they've ended up and how we look back kind of retrospectively. But I think certainly with our main kind of barbarian guy, Tyrol, I think his name is, again, it just seems a little bit overcooked in regard to some of the kind of the campy hamminess that this movie is trying to do. And, you know, again, it's trying to be a somewhat comedic movie, but I just think it just over kind of does it just a little bit kind of here and there. And if you really want to be a picky person, yes, this movie kind of looks cheap. I mean, it's meant to. That's the whole point of this movie. It's meant to be emulating those low budget films, but I feel if you are going into this maybe as a younger person or a person who isn't familiar with a lot of these 80s sword and sorcery movies, it's just going to look cheap. And you won't have that kind of that point of reference that it's kind of, that's what it's kind of going for. So there is that. But there are a couple of occasions where the kind of the modern sort of side of stuff shows through a little bit well. For example, we have these CGI dragons, and obviously we didn't really get that in the 80s movies and stuff. So it does kind of betray its kind of 80s style for more modern kind of technology, and like these CGI dragons and a lot of green screen and things like that. So overall, I think this is a fun movie. I don't think it's entirely successful, but I do think it has enough reverence, elements of fun, action, and just reverence for that 80s and kind of stylistic choices that make it worth a watch, certainly. I'm going to give this one an above average score of 6, even though I think maybe I can understand some people just seeing how this is like, oh, it's kind of cheap. But I think it's for the movie that it's trying to be, it succeeds mostly. So 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.